There is a document sitting inside the published proceedings of the New York State Archaeological Association from 1891 that almost no one has read. It is not a conspiracy pamphlet. It is not a fringe manuscript passed between amateur historians in underground circles. It was compiled by a formally trained ethnographer, submitted through an established institutional channel, reviewed by credentialed observers of its time, and then placed into the archive where most uncomfortable things eventually end up. Cited once. Referenced almost never. Forgotten almost entirely. Inside that document, a gathering of Mohawk elders from the northern reaches of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy described in careful and specific terms a civilization that had built massive stone structures across the northeastern corridor of North America long before any Europeans set foot on the continent. Long before any civilization that the accepted historical record is prepared to credit with that level of engineering capacity. They did not describe simple cairns or rough field shelters. They did not describe the kind of opportunistic stacking that a people might do to mark a trail or store grain. They described organized, large-scale construction operations. They described a people who understood stone the way an architectural society understands raw material. A people who quarried, shaped, transported, and assembled with a precision that the Mohawk oral tradition had preserved across what the elders themselves acknowledged was a very long time. And the question those elders left sitting in the 1891 record has never been satisfactorily answered by anyone in a position of institutional authority. Who built what they described, and where did those builders go? To understand why that question matters, you have to start with the structures themselves, because the structures are the part of this story that cannot be argued away. The northeastern corridor of North America, running from the St. Lawrence River Valley south through the Hudson Valley and into the hill country of western New England, sits on top of one of the most extraordinary and least discussed archaeological landscapes on the continent. Stone chambers, dolmen-style capstone arrangements, precisely aligned standing stones, underground megalithic enclosures with corbelled ceilings built from slabs weighing several tons each, fitted together without mortar, with a tolerance that a modern stonemason would find difficult to replicate. There are over 3,000 documented stone structures of anomalous origin in New England alone. The scholar and archaeologist Maver and Dix catalogued hundreds of them in their 1989 study. Researchers from the Early Sites Research Society have been mapping them for decades. They are not hidden. You can walk to them. Some of them sit 200 yards from a state highway. Some have been incorporated into the boundaries of modern farms. Some have been demolished to clear fields, their stones reused for colonial-era walls, their original function erased before anyone thought to ask what it was. The modern explanation offered by mainstream archaeology for the majority of these structures is that they are colonial-era root cellars and field shelters built by European settlers in the 17th and 18th centuries. That explanation has always had a problem. Several problems, in fact. Root cellars built by colonial farmers do not have astronomically aligned entrances. They do not have corbelled ceilings requiring engineering knowledge that colonial-era settlers in the Northeast did not demonstrably possess. They do not appear on the earliest colonial land surveys as pre-existing structures that the surveyors themselves noted and questioned. And they do not cluster in patterns across the landscape that correspond, as researchers have repeatedly demonstrated, to solar and lunar alignments significant across spans of centuries. The colonial root cellar explanation was not arrived at through careful investigation. It was arrived at through assumption. The assumption that nothing of archaeological significance could have been built in North America before European contact that mainstream archaeology had not already accounted for. The Mohawk elders of 1891 did not share that assumption. They remembered who built those structures, and what they remembered was not vague. Before we go further, I want you to do something for me. If this kind of buried investigation is what you come to this channel for, hit subscribe now. The algorithm does not surface this material unless you tell it to. The next investigation drops when the next piece of the record is ready. Make sure it finds you. The Mohawk are one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the people that European colonists called the Iroquois. Their territory, centered on what is now upstate New York, extending north to the St. Lawrence and east toward the Green Mountains of Vermont. They were, in the most literal geographic sense, the inheritors of exactly the landscape where the anomalous stone structures are most densely concentrated. Their oral tradition is one of the most carefully documented of any indigenous nation in North America, beginning with the early Jesuit relations of the 17th century and continuing through the sustained ethnographic work of Lewis Henry Morgan in the mid-19th century. By the time the 1891 proceedings were compiled, there was already a substantial scholarly infrastructure around Haudenosaunee oral tradition, which is precisely why what the Mohawk elders said in that document is so difficult to set aside. The accounts were not collected from a single informant. They were gathered from multiple elders across 3 separate communities, cross-referenced by the ethnographer who compiled them, and published with the kind of methodological notes that distinguish serious documentation from anecdote. The elders knew they were being recorded. They chose their words with the deliberateness of people who understood that what they were transmitting mattered. What they transmitted was this. Before the Haudenosaunee established dominance in the northeastern corridor, before the formation of the Confederacy itself, which oral tradition and some scholarly analysis places somewhere between 900 and 1450 CE, the landscape was occupied by a different people. Not a different indigenous nation in the way the Mohawk understood nationhood, something older than that, something that predated the political and territorial arrangements that the Haudenosaunee themselves had inherited. The Mohawk called them, across the various tellings recorded in 1891, the Stone People, the ones who shaped the hills, the people of the long memory, and in one account that the ethnographer marked as coming from the eldest informant, the people who came before the ice finished melting. That last description is worth sitting with for a moment. The people who came before the ice finished melting. This is not a poetic flourish in a creation story. This is a temporal marker. The elders were placing the stone builders in a period that overlaps with what geologists call the late Pleistocene transition, the period between approximately 12,000 and 8,000 years before the present, during which the Laurentide ice sheet retreated from the northeastern corridor and the landscape assumed something close to its modern form. If the oral tradition is preserving an accurate temporal memory, then the stone builders were operating in northeastern North America at a date that the conventional archaeological timeline does not accommodate. Not by a small margin, by thousands of years. The elders described the stone builders as distinct in appearance from any people the Mohawk recognized from their own genealogical memory. They were described in terms suggesting a physical type the Mohawk associated specifically with these builders, and with no other group they had contact with. They were described as numerous, not a wandering band, not a small community of specialists, but a population substantial enough to sustain the kind of construction program the landscape still evidences. They were described as possessing knowledge of the sky, not in the ceremonial sense that most indigenous traditions incorporate astronomical observation, but in a practical and almost mechanical sense. The 1891 accounts describe the stone builders as people who arranged their structures according to the movements of heavenly bodies with a precision that the Mohawk oral tradition explicitly associated with purpose rather than ritual. The elders described watching positions, sight lines built into the stone that allowed the same alignment to be observed from the same point year after year across generations. This matches the physical evidence exactly. The stone chambers of the Hudson Valley in western New England have been surveyed by archaeoastronomers repeatedly since the 1970s. The alignments are real. They are not accidental. A chamber entrance oriented to catch the first light of the winter solstice sunrise does not happen by accident when the chamber is built from multi-ton stone slabs fitted to tolerances of less than an inch. It happens by design, by measurement, by a knowledge of solar movement precise enough to build that measurement permanently into stone. The elders described the relationship between the stone builders and the landscape as one of deep intentionality. Every structure had a reason, every placement had a logic. The Mohawk oral tradition, as recorded in 1891, does not describe the stone builders as people who built at random or built for convenience. It describes them as people who were mapping something, encoding something into the landscape in a form designed to outlast the people who built it. That detail, encoding something into the landscape, becomes important when you hold it against what archaeoastronomers and landscape researchers have found when they step back far enough to look at the distribution of these structures, not individually, but as a system. The distribution is not random. That is the conclusion that researchers who have mapped the full extent of the northeastern stone structures keep arriving at, and it is a conclusion that carries implications the mainstream archaeological community has not been willing to engage with seriously. When you plot the locations of the major stone chambers, the standing stone alignments, the dolmen arrangements, and the corbelled enclosures across the northeastern corridor on a single map, patterns emerge. Clusters appear along specific ridge lines. Structures separated by 30 or 40 miles share orientations precise enough that they could only have been coordinated by people working from a common plan across a common landscape. The system, if that is what it is, covers an area roughly the size of England. Building a coordinated astronomical network across that scale requires more than local knowledge. It requires survey capability. It requires the ability to establish a common reference point and work outward from it consistently across terrain that, in the post-glacial period, was heavily forested, cut by rivers, and geographically complex. It requires, in short, an organized civilization with the technical capacity to execute a generational construction program across a large and difficult landscape. The Mohawk elders in 1891 described exactly that. They described coordination, multiple groups working in different locations according to what the accounts called a single understanding. The ethnographer who recorded this noted it without apparent recognition of its significance. He was looking for folklore. What he recorded was a description of project management at a civilizational scale. Here is what makes the 1891 documentation particularly significant. It predates the hardening of the academic consensus against pre-Columbian complexity in North America. The elders who gave testimony were not speaking into a conversation already shaped by what archaeologists wanted them to say. They were describing what their tradition had preserved without the institutional pressure to make it fit a predetermined framework. That kind of testimony is rare. Once the paradigm hardens, it becomes nearly impossible to collect. The physical evidence and the oral testimony are pointing in the same direction. Structures built to last. Knowledge encoded into stone. A people organized enough to execute it. And then, as the Mohawk accounts consistently describe, a departure, not a collapse, not a catastrophe, a withdrawal. The stone builders finished what they were doing and they left the landscape to the people who came after. The Mohawk noticed the silence when the building stopped. They kept the memory of the work. And in 1891 they handed that memory to a man with a notebook who filed it in an archive where it has been sitting ever since. There is a specific detail from the 1891 accounts that deserves close attention because it has a parallel in the physical archaeological record that almost nobody has connected publicly. The Mohawk elders described the stone builders as people who worked in seasons. They did not occupy the construction sites year-round. They arrived at specific times, worked with intense coordination for defined periods, and then withdrew to locations the Mohawk oral tradition places to the north and east, toward the Great Water. The seasonal pattern the elders described matches something that archaeologists studying the construction logistics of megalithic sites in Europe have identified as a signature characteristic of organized stone-building cultures. You do not maintain a permanent settlement at a quarry or a construction site. You mobilize, you build, you withdraw. The work camps leave minimal trace. The structures themselves are what survives. That directional detail toward the Great Water to the north and east is not incidental. The elders were not gesturing vaguely. North and east of the Mohawk heartland in upstate New York is the St. Lawrence River, and beyond it the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and beyond that the open North Atlantic. The same ocean that Bronze Age maritime cultures were crossing from the other direction during the same approximate period that the northeastern stone structures were being built. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to contain within the boundaries of conventional history. The megalithic building tradition of Western Europe, the same tradition that produced Stonehenge, the passage tombs of Ireland, the stone alignments of Brittany, and hundreds of lesser-known but equally sophisticated structures across the Atlantic facade of Europe, shares specific technical characteristics with the stone chambers of northeastern North America. Corbelled ceilings, astronomical alignments, capstone construction using multi-ton slabs, entrance orientations calibrated to solstice and equinox events, underground chambers designed to capture and hold specific light events at specific times of year. These are not general similarities, they are specific engineering decisions that require specific knowledge to execute. The corbelled ceiling in particular is a technique that requires understanding of how to distribute load through a curved stone surface without mortar. It is not intuitive, it is learned, and it appears on both sides of the Atlantic in structures that the conventional timeline insists were built by peoples who had no contact with each other. The mainstream explanation is independent invention. Two separate building traditions arrived at the same sophisticated technical solutions through parallel development with no connection between them. That explanation becomes harder to sustain the more specific the similarities become. At a certain level of specificity, independent invention stops being a satisfying answer and starts being a placeholder for something we have not yet been willing to say out loud. The Mohawk elders were willing to say it. They said it in 1891 to a man with a notebook. The people who built those structures came from across the Great Water, worked the land with purpose and precision across many generations, encoded something into the northeastern landscape in stone designed to outlast everything else, and then returned to wherever they had come from. That testimony sits in the archive. The structures sit in the landscape. The alignments still work. On the winter solstice, in a corbelled stone chamber in the hills of western New England that mainstream archaeology insists is a colonial root cellar, the rising sun still enters through the entrance passage and illuminates the back wall exactly as it was designed to do, possibly 4,000 years ago, possibly longer. Nobody designed a root cellar that way. Somebody designed that chamber with knowledge of where the sun would be on the shortest day of the year, and built that knowledge permanently into stone so that it would still be true when everyone who built it was gone. The Mohawk remembered who that somebody was. They held that memory for thousands of years across an unbroken chain of deliberate transmission, and they gave it away in 1891 to people who wrote it down and moved on. The record is still there. The stones are still there. The light still enters on the morning it was always meant to enter. The only thing missing is the willingness to ask what all of it means when you hold it together and refuse to look away. If this investigation moves something in you, share it with one person. The official history of this continent is missing chapters, and the only way those chapters get written is if enough of us refuse to stop asking. I will see you in the next investigation. Until then, count your stones.